All right, and so if I had to say this out in the public space, which I probably will discuss this at some point, I'd probably get crucified by all the Insta personal trainers and females out there selling their $199 booty band programs. The reality is, when it comes to training the glutes, resistance bands or booty bands or whatever we want to call them, mini bands, really don't provide all that much effectiveness that we actually think they do. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't ever serve a purpose, that they don't ever come into play at some point. We definitely can use them, to create a little bit of a metabolic stimulus. We can definitely use them to create a little bit of awareness and sensation, which, we obviously have talked a lot about being wary of sensation during this course, and it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes we want to bring in awareness to a body part or to feeling a muscle working. However, when it's masked or almost kind of a veil put over, it's like, well, if you add, like, say, a hip thruster with a mini band at the same time, that's going to make the movement exponentially more effective, when in fact the actual reality of that is we actually do the opposite. We make it less effective, and we'll record a separate video at a later date showing exactly that as well. But really what we're looking at with the mini bands is, where does it have utility? Well, again, if we just remind you of some of the lines of force, what Mal could potentially do, and maybe we use this as a bit of a support here, we could potentially have Mal just go in that straight extension plane, so she could potentially do some hip extensions, and that's a perfectly fine movement to do, and that might help her get a little bit of activation. Now, one thing we have to bear in mind here is that from a resistance profile perspective, a mini band actually is not very favourable. Now, don't get me wrong, it depends on the strength and the resistance and the magnitude of change of the resistance band as you go from the starting point to the end point, but ultimately we're always creating a greater challenge where the glute gets weaker. And from a resistance profile perspective, that's not necessarily ideal, and there's probably a lot of better options that we could use, like, for example, doing cable kickbacks and all those sort of things, but done in the right sort of way. Then we could look at the glute med plane, where Mal could move out into that kind of 30-degree angle. That's also perfectly legitimate to do as well, as long as we know what we're doing. And of course, if we wanted to hit that glute minimus on the outside of the glutes, we could definitely do straight leg abductions and things like that, and potentially bent knee abductions as well, to a degree. So let's do that for a second. Mal, bend your knee and abduct. So we could definitely do that. However, we just have to be aware that this is not going to provide much of a challenge, a resistance challenge. Yes, we're acting against the resistance of the band, but we're incredibly limited with what we're actually going to get out of that. So really the key message to take away from this is that when it comes to building glutes, we prioritize progressive resistance training. We prioritize movements that are actually going to allow us to provide a significant challenge through its contractile range, whether that be through one exercise or a combination of many different exercises. Now, just to finish off, just to cover kind of what we covered in here as well, though, we see a lot of this kind of like bent over abductions and things as well. So do that now for me, Mal. But really bent over, and doing those abductions and coming out. So no, actually with your feet here and doing abductions. So we see a lot of these kind of driving the knees out, pushing the knees out. And again, like we talked about with the hips in this sort of flex position and doing these abductions, we think we're building like big glutes or really like building that booty with doing these. But the reality is, like I said, all we're really working is really that piriformis. And actually, if we're just doing tons and tons of banded abductions and seated abductions over time, if we're not careful with how often we're doing that, volume, and obviously thinking about the other programming and kind of muscles that we're training, the other considerations, we often find that actually a lot of people can end up with a lot of hip issues because they're just essentially overworking that piriformis versus actually putting the time and effort into those, essentially the superficial glute musculature that we're trying to build, which is that glute max, medium, minimus. So this is just something to be incredibly aware of when it comes to the use of mini bands. I wouldn't demonize them per se, but I also wouldn't waste a lot of time on using them when we've got far more effective options for creating an effective stimulus of the glutes.